All right, good afternoon everyone and welcome to the Wheeler Centre and this week's Text in the City session on Jane Austen's Persuasion. My name is Lily Wilkinson, I'm a young adult author and academic, and talking to me this afternoon is the wonderful Laura Carroll. Laura researches and teaches English literature at La Trobe University. Her academic work as a teacher, a scholar and a critic focuses on two themes. One of them is Jane Austen, which is good for you guys, and the various ways that we readers continue to enjoy her fiction, and the other is textual transmission, especially the adaptations of novels into film. Please make Laura welcome. All right, so tell us how you first discovered Jane Austen.
Oh, that's a difficult question to answer. I'm afraid it's lost in the mists of time. I think I was a fairly voracious reader of what I perceived as girly books when I was a teenager, and I had a penchant for reading books over and over again, but not all books will stand up to this. Jane Austen's novels do. So I think perhaps it was reading Emma and Persuasion and then immediately going back to the beginning and rereading them again that really alerted me to the fact that these books were something special. And as I mentioned to Lily, I'm pretty sure that I first read Persuasion around about the time that I'd been dumped by my first serious boyfriend, and I thought that I was never going to recover. So I had a pretty strong identification with Anne Elliot then and there. And I think a Jane Austen novel is a good one to read in that situation because you do learn from Austen's novels, and I believe that you learn things from Austen's novels. You learn that life goes on and things get better, which is a great thing.
I should have done that one. I got dumped at about the same age. I just watched 7 seasons of The Muppets, which didn't teach me very much at all. So Persuasion is Jane Austen's last completed novel. That's
right. It's the last one that she finished before she died. And I hesitated to say the word finished because me and many other scholars are not entirely sure that she did finish it and sign off on it. It was seen through the publication process by her brother Henry. There seemed to me to be some rough edges in it. It's the only finished novel of Jane Austen's for which we've got some parts of it, the manuscript written in her own handwriting. If you have a reasonably good edition, perhaps the Penguin edition, it will include the two kind of alternative chapters towards the end, which she wrote in the first version and then discarded and rewrote a much better version. And we don't know for sure that she called it Persuasion either, which is interesting. It was referred to in the family as the Elliots. I always think that throws an interesting light on the novel to think what she may have called it and how we might perceive it if it didn't have this name, Persuasion.
That is very interesting.
Yeah.
So in what ways do you think that Persuasion is different to the other Jane Austen novels?
I think it's a novel by a person who is completely aware of her own powers and who is looking to push her art to a new level and is finding ways of doing that. And it's a shame that, for many reasons, I guess, it's a shame that she died before she could really get anywhere. I think this is a novel in a kind of artistic transition. It's a good deal shorter, a good deal more compact than her other novels. The book that she wrote just before Persuasion, Emma, is more than 50 chapters, 52 chapters, I think. Persuasion is 24 chapters, I think, 23 or 24. So that's a big indication of something that's going on in the book, and that is extreme economy of style. She's able to convey heaps by saying very, very little. It's almost at the opposite to something like Emma or even to Pride and Prejudice, where the novelist is kind of letting things unfold in all of their kind of excitement and fun. And in this novel, there's a real sense that, come on, we've got to get on with things. And that has to do, I think, with the historical setting. You will have noticed that the novel is set towards the end of the period of England's war with France. It's set very specifically, in fact, in what's called the False Peace. You know about this? 1814 was what everyone thought was the end of the Napoleonic Wars. There were treaties signed in France, but Napoleon escaped from his imprisonment and it was all back on again in 1815, and then the war was brought to a fairly rapid conclusion after that. But Jane Austen has set this novel at a time when war is both a fact of everyday life and something that people are really tired of. So it's not like Pride and Prejudice, for instance, where the romance that is happening between these gorgeous, fantastic young people is the most important thing that's happening in the world. This is a story where you cannot keep the outside world away. You cannot avoid the march of time. You cannot escape the fact that bad things happen. This is what makes the novel, I think, something that really speaks to us now.
I think that's very true, and that kind of notion of war, and even like in the very last paragraph of the book, she's like, and then everyone's really happy except there may be more war. Like, it's always there. There's always that reminder that things can, it's not necessarily going to be a happily ever after. It's also, I think, a very kind of biting class commentary as well, in perhaps a way that isn't necessarily seen as much in some of the earlier books. What do you think that Jane Austen was trying to say about class?
I think she may be thinking her way through issues of class that she was less interested in attacking full on in earlier works. I think, again, this comes down to my sense of Persuasion being a novel that is really out there in the world and taking issues on. Emma, the novel Emma, which comes directly before Persuasion, is set in a very little community and no one ever really leaves, and everything's kind of hunky-dory within that community. Everyone's in their proper place. In this novel, it's very clear that people who have kind of position, rank, in Jane Austen's word, not only may not deserve that because they're kind of vain idiots like Sir Walter Elliot, they actually can do some damage. And what this novel is thinking about is whether, I guess, in the broader sense, the English community, the English nation needs to persist with this class system that it's got, or whether it should just walk away, whether people should just walk away. And I really think that through Anne Elliot's discovery of this naval fraternity, the Naval Brotherhood, Wentworth and his wonderful friends, that's what she's doing. She's walking away. I think that's great. It's remarkable.
And it's clearly, like, it was clearly a very big issue in England and sort of persisted. You can see the same issue in Downton Abbey, for example, is a very kind of similar thing about, do we continue with this aristocracy and is it something worth preserving? And it seems that certainly as far as Anne Elliot is concerned, it probably isn't. And that the people who she paints very flatteringly in the book are people with jobs. They're the naval officers and these people who are useful members of society.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I think you find members of the landed gentry in other novels who are useful members of society and who are doing something worthwhile with their position. But in this novel, no. Basically nobody. And one of the things that indicates, I think, is that the gentry system and the feudal system gives people very few opportunities to make the best of themselves. And at the beginning of the novel has been too little seen. Her friend Lady Russell thinks. She's been locked in this kind of grief, but she's also been physically kind of stuck at Kellynch. She hasn't been able to go anywhere, to get away from the things that are making life difficult for her. And it's not until she physically leaves, until she goes to Uppercross, and then until she goes to Lyme, that she's able to kind of flower. And by that I don't mean necessarily physically bloom, although that does happen. She is able to kind of step up and take command, have some influence on people's lives. And that's something that she's always been capable of, but was never going to get the opportunity to do where she was before.
And she clearly has a lot of influence on her rest of her family, and particularly on Mary and everybody. She becomes very dependable and everyone kind of wants her around for comfort, which is very interesting compared to the beginning of the novel where she's so kind of empty and frozen and just doesn't seem to do anything.
Yes, it's such a remarkable place to start a novel with this Anne Elliot character who, if you when you look at the novel, she's basically an aside in the first chapter, which is all about Sir Walter Elliot's sense of himself as reflected through this kind of ridiculous description of his family and his status in the baronetage, and figures very, very minimally in this because, of course, as an unmarried middle daughter, she just has no value in this system. But this is followed through in what I think is so interesting is that the way this is followed through in the narrative technique and the way that, in turn, that comes out of what's happened to her in her life. You hardly see into Anne's mind at all. It's not, we know that she's there in the room when important things about the future of the Elliot family are being discussed, but we don't really know what she's thinking. We maybe hear her voice, her gentle voice saying, oh yes, that's Admiral Croft, he was a Rear Admiral of the White and he's Captain Wentworth's brother-in-law. But we have no real sense of what all of these things mean to her. We just have to pick up these little hints, whereas another novelist might perhaps have taken us into the secret of what Anne was thinking and feeling. But Anne's kind of emotional frozenness, I'm suggesting, is so complete that the novel, in fact, shuts us out of what she's feeling. And she has to kind of thaw out over the course of the first few chapters, which I think is a really interesting thing for a novelist to do, and it has a big payoff in this book.
It is really interesting, and she's almost quite unlikable at the beginning of the book because she's just so kind of frozen, as you said. And in a letter, Jane Austen described Anne Elliot as being almost too good to be true. Oh, sorry, almost too good for me. Do you think she's too good to be true?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Bordering on, perhaps. Bordering on.
Because sort of I remember the first time I read the book, and she's so different compared to a lot of the other Austen heroines, whereas Lizzie Bennet or Emma's flaws are possibly that they're too energetic, that they're too judgmental or too fiery tempered or too meddling, whereas hers is the opposite. It's like she's too passive, if anything, that she doesn't, she sort of stands back so much.
I think she has something to struggle against in her own personality that you also find in Fanny Price, the heroine of Mansfield Park, and that is a tendency to convert feelings that we, as 20/21st century readers, we want to see these people respond to their situation with a bit of rebellion, with a bit of anger, whether they express it on the outside or feel it on the inside. But Anne has a tendency to convert people misusing her to feelings that she should be grateful. She should be grateful for what she gets to them, or she should make some kind of allowance for them. And you see her often working to convert her feelings of, let's say, her feelings of being not quite happy with the way that Lady Russell behaves. Such an interesting character, Lady Russell. To making all kinds of allowances for Lady Russell, saying, oh, well, she meant well and all this. I wish that she wouldn't do that, basically. I wish she would give Lady Russell the flick and stop listening to her. But, maybe the novel wouldn't be as interesting if it did exactly what I wanted it to do.
Yeah, well, that's very true, and I find myself constantly throughout that book wanting to shake her and just go, why don't you just go and tell Wentworth how you feel? But, of course, then it would be a much, much shorter novel.
It would, yeah. I mean, it's always interesting to think about how a novelist kind of deals with that, because I'm sure that the first readers were just like us, wanted Anne to just kind of march up and declare her feelings to Wentworth and then it'd all be resolved happily. But she very cleverly puts in a whole lot of obstacles, and I think Walter Elliot is one of the most interesting of these. Walter Elliot. And then again, there's echoes of that Pride and Prejudice thing, how there's the embarrassing family following you around. Something that I think teenagers are very responsive to in Jane Austen's novels, that the sense that your family, oh my God, can they just stop embarrassing me, please? Anne Elliot has this to deal with as well, because her father and her older sister are so incredibly appalling. So Austen is really good at kind of drawing out her novel as well as telescoping events for us, I think.
Let's talk about that thing, which is sort of a great source of humour, I think, in the book. We were talking before about, the great Walter Elliott moments of when he's walking down the street and he sees 78 women and they were all ugly, and what a terrible thing that was. And there is a kind of like a bitingness in the humour in this book that Lizzie Bennet's parents and family are very embarrassing, but we know that she still really loves them. Whereas I don't really get the feeling that Anne, I mean, she may love them in a familiar sense, but I don't feel like she's fond of her family.
Be interesting to, I think, try to work out what exactly the novel was saying about that there. I have a feeling that if you looked at it very carefully, you might find clues that Anne does not love her father and sister at all, which would be an incredibly radical thing, I think, to find in a novel written by someone who we associate so clearly with the value of community and the value of kind of family ties. Certainly, though, the novelist, the narrator, does not love Sir Walter Elliott, except, relishing him as a kind of fantastically ridiculous figure. And I think this is a novel where the narrator, being quite above the action, is able to bring out a lot of the funny stuff in what's going on in the book. What can I say about Sir Walter Elliott? Fantastic, hilarious, incredibly awful. I can imagine what it'd be like to have him as a parent. I don't know that it's completely by accident that his, the thing that is beginning and end of his character, and that is vanity, is traditionally seen as a female vice. I don't think that's quite an accident. I think it's quite remarkable, though. I love how he suggests to Anne that she must have been using Gowland's lotion on her face, some kind of Pond's cream, cold cream of the late 18th century, I suppose. Yeah.
And let's talk a bit about Lady Russell, who is sort of in a lot of ways a surrogate parent, and certainly probably does a lot more parenting than Sir Walter does. Do you think she's a good parent? Do you think Anne is right when at the end of the book she says that she thinks that Lady Russell was right to meddle?
No, I don't think that she is a good parent. And I think that the narrative is fairly clear that she's had a negative influence on Anne's life. I would hope to learn as a parent not to be like Lady Russell, not to, getting back to what I was saying about maybe seeing its interesting thought experiment, to see this novel not through the lens of this title, Persuasion. I've been racking my brain trying to think of another title that might work. And I'm grasping for something like putting your faith in what might come. There's a series of phrases in the book about having faith in the future, and that's something that Lady Russell conspicuously doesn't have. She's very, very aware of everything that might go wrong, and I don't really think that's the best way to be. I certainly don't think that's something that an older person should put on a younger person, especially someone who's young and in love.
It's interesting, though, that whole kind of that judgment of Lady Russell for meddling and is kind of exactly what Anne is doing herself by trying to keep her father away from Mrs. Clay, and that's something that the novel is clearly saying it would be a terrible thing to meddle in that. So how is that different?
Well, it's different in that Anne and Wentworth are wonderful human beings, obviously in love with each other. Why shouldn't they be?
But Mrs. Clay and Sir Walter are both horrible human beings, so, aren't they as equally suited?
Well, I guess there's a balance there, but you know that they're not the same. They're not the same thing. Yeah, she's after his money. It's not the same thing at all. Lady Russell, I think, is so interesting because, again, this question of the distance that the novelist can take from her characters, we hardly ever see what it is that Lady Russell really thinks. And when we do see, it's kind of surprising. It's like, oh, she's really quite. There's a moment when she's hearing some second or maybe even third-hand gossip about this idea that everybody has at that point of the novel that Wentworth is falling in love with Louisa Musgrove. And Lady Russell, the phrase goes something like, internally her heart revelled in angry contempt that a man who had once appeared to see the value of an Anne Elliot could now be satisfied with a Louisa Musgrove. And that doesn't tally with Lady Russell's very kind of patrician behaviour on the outside. It really doesn't. It seems to me that she's perhaps, that's just a hint of her being quite an angry, passionate person inside. Why has Jane Austen kind of chosen to give us just this one glimpse?
Yeah, that is interesting.
Yes.
And let's talk about Admiral and Mrs. Croft, who I think are very much held up in the book as being sort of like the ideal marriage. Do you think that their marriage is kind of a modern marriage in a lot of ways?
I think it may be even more modern than a modern marriage that we might call a modern marriage, because I don't actually think that we are quite as good as the Regency people are at coping with the idea of a successful marriage that is childless. Many readers have suggested that Jane Austen, as a childless person herself, was, saved her best approval, saved, the happiest marriages for people who weren't, I guess, burdened with children. I don't quite agree with that. But yeah, I think the fact that they have what is clearly a really developed and quite sophisticated partnership, that they've shared some really interesting experiences, and they seem to be just as into each other as many of the people who are just getting married. It's quite interesting. Yeah. It's something I think that breaks up that perception that Jane Austen's novels are just about the process of getting to being married, because you get snapshots of people at different stages in their marriages.
Yeah, that's true. And it's certainly the only kind of couple I can think of off the top of my head in a Jane Austen novel that you kind of see hanging out together and enjoying each other's company, and not just being, people who happen to be married but kind of don't really have much in common, which I think is really interesting. Do you think that kind of relationship was something that Jane Austen herself aspired to? Is it something that she wanted?
That's very interesting. I have no sense of the personal, the real Jane Austen having wished for a dramatically different life to the one that she had. I'm sure she wanted to live longer than she did, and would have preferred not to have had, this is obvious, would have preferred not to have had a debilitating illness. But I've never had a strong sense that she wished that she could have married or travelled much, which is the other thing that Mrs. Croft has done with her husband.
Yeah. Anne tells Captain Harville at one point, she says, "Men have had every advantage of us in telling their own story. The pen has been in their hands." Do you think that Persuasion is a work of feminism?
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's a very sophisticated piece of thinking about resetting gender roles, about the good things that might come from a shaking up of assigned gender roles, making it possible for women to go places and do things that they have been prevented from doing in the past, and of opening up different kinds of emotional experiences to men that haven't been available to them either, definitely.
And do you think that Anne, and sort of by extension Jane a little bit, but mostly Anne, is frustrated at the fact that her femininity is or her femaleness is sort of a trap in a lot of ways that prevents her from doing and saying the things that she wants to do and say?
Personally, I would be quite careful about saying something like that, because as I tried to say earlier, I don't think that the novel gives you enough to go on about what's going on inside the locked up, isolated, psychologically frozen Anne Elliot at the beginning of the novel.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Now, you said something in an email about dance and how at the end of the book, when the couple are walking through Bath, what is the thing? They are spirits dancing in private rapture. And you made a really, really interesting comment on the sort of the evolving nature of dance in the Regency era. Tell these guys.
All right. Well, this comes more out of my own interests, I guess. I like dancing. I love dressing up in Jane Austen outfits and dancing.
Who doesn't?
Who doesn't? And so I've tried to combine, you know, the serious scholarly pursuits with this interest. And so I've learned quite a bit about the evolution of dance over the period that Jane Austen worked. And we all have an idea in our heads of Jane Austen type dancing being the stuff that you see in Pride and Prejudice, a long row of men and women facing each other in a room, moving through these kind of fairly stately figures, you know, backwards and forwards, in and out, looping through one another. But that comes from the 1790s and earlier. That's an 18th century form of dance. And it is a form of dance that only makes sense when a couple, a man and a woman, are doing it with a whole lot of other people who are doing the same moves. You know what I mean? If you've seen that 2005 movie of Pride and Prejudice with Keira Knightley, you might remember there's a scene where Elizabeth and Darcy are dancing together and everyone else vanishes because they've only got eyes for each other. But it becomes kind of silly, but silly in a modern way, because what we think about when we think about a man and woman dancing together is that it's a private thing. It's a private expression of their feelings for one another. It's definitely a sexual thing. And it's something that, if you do it with the whole community, it's a little bit weird. Now, I was quite delighted to discover that the waltz, you know, people holding each other close and whirling around together in such a way that if you see everybody else in the room, it's only as a kind of a blur, came to England at about the time that Persuasion is set. And it caused a huge scandal. Don't you love that?
Super raunchy.
It was so raunchy that even Lord Byron thought that it was raunchy, and if he thought it was raunchy...
Didn't you have to be like a certain age? I remember reading in a George A. Hayer book that you had to be at a certain age before you were allowed to waltz.
I think it was definitely the aristocratic, rakish figures who brought it in. And like all these things, it gradually, you know, became accepted. But the point is that I think you see Jane Austen hooking into the zeitgeist with the way that she's thinking about a man and a woman coming together in Persuasion as being like a waltz, rather than being like partners who stand opposite each other in a country dance in a room full of everyone in the community's there, they're all doing the same pattern. This is what we think of as a romance. And we don't see anything as kind of obvious in this novel as Anne and Wentworth, you know, rushing into one another's arms across a ballroom and doing a waltz in the spotlight or anything. But at the very end of the novel, after that kind of endlessly incredible scene where Wentworth overhears Anne talking, I think it's worth pointing out that he hears her across the room. He can pick out her voice. They come together in Bath, walking up the streets of Bath. They're arm in arm. So they're together in public, but they're very much alone in a private space. And the phrase that Austen uses is spirits dancing in private rapture. And that, I think, shows that she's thinking about how all of the different kind of everyday art forms that people like Anne and Wentworth use that give meaning to their lives, the ways that she can bring them into her own art in a way that's very, very natural but also has some symbolic resonance. So I think it wouldn't have been possible for her to think of lovers as having their spirits dancing in private rapture when they're just calmly walking along the street in public, looking like any other couple calmly walking up the street, but inside there's this incredible ferment of emotion. Wouldn't have been possible for her to think that 20, 30 years earlier.
Awesome. So let's just go back momentarily to that scene where he overhears Anne talking. That scene was written differently in an earlier draft.
Didn't appear at all in an earlier draft.
And why do you think it was added?
I think it was added because it was important for the structure of the novel, for the way that the novel works, that Wentworth becomes able to pick Anne out from a crowd, to pick her out and catch her. Remember, he fails to catch Louisa when she jumps off the cob. You could almost say that Anne has been in a kind of free fall ever since they were parted early on. But what happens in that very everyday scene in the White Hart Inn at Bath is that Anne has found her voice at last, and she's saying some really interesting things in a general sense about the difference between men and women. And Wentworth is now able to discern her tones above everybody else's, to pick out her voice among the babble of everybody else's, and to understand that things that other people might see her as saying as just kind of generally interesting things, that they really matter for his life and for her life. And then when he writes to her, it's almost like a role reversal. She's been the one who speaks, as men traditionally have done, had the voice, and he's the one who makes the private communication. I just think it's beautiful.
And it definitely gives her a kind of a level of agency and participation in their getting together, which I don't think would exist without it. Like if it was just her being normal Anne and then he declares his love for her, it's sort of, you know, she needs to do something heroic as well. And I think she does in that conversation
She
by
absolutely does.
really bearing her soul.
Yeah.
All right, we've got a bit of time for questions from you guys now. So bring it on.
Earlier you were saying that you really don't like the role of Lady Russell and think she should kind of butt out, but like, could you continue on your, what was I going to say, like, why you think that? Because wouldn't you think that, because at the times, and like, what did she say that, you know, about class and stuff? I'm sorry, that wasn't really worded properly.
No,
I'm trying to like word it.
Good question.
Sorry. Yeah.
I understand what Lady Russell's trying to do. She's trying to maintain the way things are. And she thinks that she can control the future. Maybe 20 or 30 years ago she would have been right, or had more chance of being proven right by events, that you ought to stick with what you know and that you ought to just wait until you're getting something that you're sure of. I mean, she's telling Anne, you've got to wait till the man comes along who's just like all the other men around us, only great, only, you know, perfect. I think in the world that this novel takes place in, it's not a good idea to do that. And that's the world that we live in now. You can't. I also have a suspicion that this is a kind of a Christian principle of Jane Austen's as well, because she speaks about it in terms of trusting in providence with a capital P, which as you know is the providence of a benevolent God, that God will provide for you. Now, I think Lady Russell is unwilling to do that, unwilling to trust in the future and trust that things will turn out for the best. Now, I think whether that turns out to be a good call or not, only events can prove. But for the present, for the time being, I think it is absolutely, and now I'm speaking about the role of Lady Russell outside of the book, and as I said earlier, how the kind of parent I hope to be when my kid is old enough to be maybe asking me whether I think he should marry whoever it is. I hope that I'll have the courage to say, trust your feelings now. Don't worry too much about what might happen in the future. I think that's what the novel thinks that Lady Russell ought to have done. On the other hand, it's complicated though, because I think the novel also believes that Anne has done the right thing by listening to Lady Russell. And she couldn't really have done anything else as a decent person. This is why it works so well as a novel. Wouldn't work so well, all these issues, as a kind of debate or a philosophical problem. Works well as a novel because a novel happens in time. It's a story. You can't go back and do things differently. Not in a realistic novel anyway. Does that make sense? I just find it creepy as well.
Up there. And then one down here.
Look, I was just wondering which of the telemovies you preferred that have been done of Persuasion.
I think that's a really weird question because the 1995 one, oh my goodness. The 2007 one, I just find bizarrely strange and bad. Yeah. It's not only because Kieran Hines, who plays Captain Wentworth, is everything that Captain Wentworth should be, plus a whole lot more. That's not the only reason. I think the performances in that 1995 movie are all uniformly great, and they are so good at bringing out the funniness of Jane Austen, the funniness of people like Sir Walter Elliot. A dream part, I would have said, for anybody. It's also really interesting to watch because they do actually include bits drawn out of those abandoned chapters, which if you see the movie and you know the novel fairly well, you'll get to a point where you go, hey, what's happening? This is not in the story. And that's the bit, I'm not quite sure why they put it in, but it does make it a very interesting movie to compare to the novel. You get a sense that it could have turned out otherwise, which is a good thing with Persuasion, I think. Yeah. Yeah. There's nothing to recommend the 2005 one.
Rupert Penry-Jones seems very strange casting. He's not, rugged.
No, he's made of biscuit dough, actually.
Yeah. All right, there was one down here. Yep, sorry.
There's a scene in the book where Mrs. Croft she sort of goes on a type of proto-feminist rant over the dinner table to do with women on warships and whatnot. And I was wondering whether you find that quite a prominent part within the story itself and whether it was actually needed.
I do think it's quite a prominent part of the story because you have the sense with all of these conversations going on that Anne is sitting there listening, and it's part of the way that the novel works that you have to kind of figure out for yourself what Anne is making of these conversations, and you have to think, Anne is thinking, oh God, this just sounds fantastic. This is the life that I could have had. I could have gone to all these places, seen all these things, been with my dream man. It would have been awesome. She's sitting there thinking these things, not in that chipper way, because I think she's still really depressed at that point. And it also, I think, ought to strike the reader as being kind of surprising. Wow, women really do this? I know the first time I read Persuasion, I was surprised to know that women, the wives of officers went, as a matter of course, quite often with their husbands. I had a sense of... I don't think I quite understood that on the larger warships it was run just like a country house. A bit disappointing, really, but from a class point of view, but interesting in terms of gender. So I think it's very important for those reasons, for the content, and also because it's part of this pattern of Anne listening to things, and you have to figure out for yourself what it is that she makes of them.
I also think that it gives Wentworth a bit of a journey as well, because at the beginning of the book there he's quite, he's like, no ladies on my boat, and I feel like by the end of the novel he probably let Anne on his ship a little bit. So I think that shows his journey and that he needs to change and just as much as she does. Yeah,
that's an interesting point. In that conversation, it's a long conversation. A lot comes out about what's really going on with people from what they say to each other. You can see he's still hanging on to where he was when he was, as he perceives it, thrown over by Anne, when he was jilted by Anne. He's still quite angry with women in general. Yeah.
Yep.
What do you think of Louisa Musgrove as a character? Because she seems as a foil to Anne. Do you agree with that?
Interesting. I think this goes back to Lily's point about Anne being perhaps a little bit too good to be true. Louisa seems a little more real to me as a young girl than Anne, perhaps. Maybe that's just because Anne knows Italian, and I'm a bit suspicious of anyone who knows Italian. No, look, Louisa is definitely seen by people within the novel as a foil to Anne in a way that is perhaps not particularly nice. Like Lady Russell thinks, that Captain Wentworth, first he liked Anne, now I'm told he likes Louisa. Louisa's not much compared to Anne. And you have to think, that's very mean to see the world in that way. And one of the nice things about this novel that is much more developed than it is in her earlier novels like Sense and Sensibility is you can see that the novelist isn't kind of hanging back from that tendency of ours to compare women with one another. She lets people in the novel do it, but I'm not sure that she's into doing it quite as much herself. But on this question of doing what you feel like doing as opposed to maybe thinking about things before going ahead and doing them, which is the big thing that separates Anne and Louisa. I think I kind of have to hang with Anne on that and the older women. It is pretty stupid to jump off the cob.
But she gets a happy ending out of it.
It's true.
It worked out in the end. All right, we've got time for one last question. Yep. Fred?
If I could just go back to the enigmatic Lady Russell, would you consider at all that in persuading Anne not to take Wentworth, that it's not so much that she doesn't trust in the future, but that on the contrary, she thinks Wentworth is not good enough for Anne and she envisages a better future for Anne?
I think that's certainly how she sees it. Certainly how she sees it. And on that, as far as that goes, she can't be faulted, because there is nothing kind of cruel or low or mean-spirited in that view of things, in the idea that Anne is worth more and is a more valuable person than is represented by the possibility of marriage to this young man. Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult... The novel, I think, is deliberately organised to make it a difficult one for us to really know what we think about it. That's what I think anyway, because all of this has happened long before the action of the novel is actually put in front of us. We only know what people think about what happened nearly 8 years ago. And what I think, if I'm right, what I think the narrator tells us is that Captain Wentworth had a great deal to recommend him then and there in his manner, in his self. And perhaps from that point of view, I think she can be faulted for not having given that its due. Yeah, I mean, she does have a strong value for social status, which you can construe as being that she likes rank. That's the least flattering to her. Or you can construe that she has a value for tradition and continuity. And all of those things are important, especially when the world is in such upheaval. Yeah, it's an endlessly fascinating thing to talk about, I think.
And I think, yeah, you could probably definitely skew Lady Russell more to the latter than the former, because she does, like Anne, and doesn't seem to be particularly crazy about any of the other Elliots.
Yeah.
So, she clearly has a value for good character. And doesn't... It's like she's not like Sir Walter in the fact that he only values rank, regardless of, anything else.
Rank and handsomeness.
Yeah, rank and handsomeness, definitely. All right, well, thank you all very much for coming, and join me in thanking Laura.